So, Dr. Tommy Wood is a multifaceted neuroscientist, medical doctor, and renowned coach to world class athletes across a spectrum of sports. He boasts an impressive academic background, having obtained his undergraduate degree in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge, followed by a medical degree from the University of Oxford, and then a PhD in physiology and neuroscience from the University of Oslo. Presently, as an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington, Tommy's research delves into brain health throughout life, emphasizing brain injuries and the development of accessible tools to monitor health, performance, and longevity. His contributions extend beyond academia. He's an associate editor for the Wiley Journal, Lifestyle Medicine, a founding director of the British Society for Lifestyle Medicine, and actively consults for digital health ventures and charities. These organizations value his expertise on the profound impact of lifestyle and environmental factors on long term health and the prevention of chronic diseases. Welcome to Revitafest, Tommy. It's so good to have you here.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I recently heard an interview. It was probably a couple of months ago, the interviewer asked you, like, it was like three-quarters of the way into the interview, and he was like, "So, Tommy, is there a question that you have ever not been asked that you've wanted to be asked?" And you were like, "No, there's not. But I would like to say there is a topic that I have overemphasized that I would like to address, and that is this concept of optimization." What did you mean by that?
If I go back 5 or 6 years, maybe even more recently than that, I used the word optimal and optimize a lot. And it was all about optimizing blood tests, optimizing sleep, optimizing physical activity, optimizing anything you could possibly optimize. And this is something that's very popular now and still. And the more time that I spend both working with people and thinking about this arena, the more I believe that that's completely the wrong approach, for a few reasons. One, and hopefully we'll go through all of them, but one is that we probably don't even know what optimal is. Like that's probably not even a thing for most things, and we pretend that we do, but in reality we don't. And then we generate a huge amount of stress and anxiety while we chase this thing that we don't even know is the thing that we should be chasing. And while we do that, I think we remove a lot of joy from things that should be inherently joyful, like sleep and food and social connection. It all becomes about chasing a number, um, and that's why I have sort of pulled back from this idea of optimization. Of course, there are all of us have things that we can improve in terms of our health, our lifestyles, our relationships, and I think we should strive to do that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that having some optimal goal, some number on something that we can chase, I think that becomes problematic as we try to do that.
I mean, I love that. I'm all for that for sure. I want to kind of dig in a little bit to, we probably don't know what optimal is. Why are there these numbers that we supposedly are chasing if we don't know what they are?
So I can give you a fairly concrete example,
Yeah.
which is related to blood tests, and we can certainly go into numbers on trackers and things
Yeah.
like that because I think they suffer from some of the same issues. And again, not that these are that using these things is problematic inherently. I think it's how we use them that's the problem. So I spend a bunch of time looking at blood tests, athletes, people trying to improve their health, a broad spectrum of people. And a while back, I was introduced to this idea of the optimal range for a blood test. And this is something that I didn't come up with the idea, but I spent a lot of time digging into this. And one way that we did it, and I've worked with several people, digital health companies, companies that myself helped to found or build to do this. And so, say blood sugar, right? That's your fasting blood sugar level, or sort of a more long-term measure of that, the HbA1c. And most people probably know what these are and or have measured them, or would know how to get them. You can get these from your doctor very easily. And if I am trying to develop an optimal range for blood sugar, one thing that I would do is I'd take population level data, and there are lots of these studies here in the US, the UK. Korea has a massive population data set. Lots of countries have their own data sets. So we take these population data sets and we say, for all the people that we include, here's their range of blood sugars. And then we look at long-term risk of death, mortality risk. That's it's a hard outcome that you can sort of hang your hat on. And you say, what is the point? Or, if we look at across the range of blood sugars, at what point does your fasting blood sugar, is it associated with the lowest risk of death long term, right? And so then you would say within this range, so for fasting blood sugar, it might be somewhere between 80 and 90 or 95 milligrams per deciliter. That is in general where we see the lowest risk of death long term, right? And so that becomes our optimal range. That becomes the target that people have. Now, the problem is, or one of the problems is that you're trying to develop an optimal range in a general population and then apply that to people who probably don't fit into the population that you developed that range in. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So in the US, the vast majority, probably 90+% of adults have poor health, poor metabolic health, right? We know that. Several studies have published that. So then if I take somebody who is doing all the things that we might recommend to improve their health, they exercise frequently, they sleep well, they eat well, that person does not look anything like the average person in these big population data sets, right? Because we know in general, people are in poor health, they don't sleep well, they don't exercise, they don't eat well. So I've taken data from a big population data set and I've used that to generate my optimal range. And then I'm applying that to somebody who looks nothing like the people that I developed that range in. And in statistics, this is one of the rules that you cannot do. You cannot extrapolate something from one population into another population if they don't look the same. And so in general, the people who are trying to optimize don't look a lot like the data sets that you use to develop these optimal ranges. And so that's what I mean when I say we don't know what optimal look like, because I'm taking an optimal range for blood sugar and using it in myself. And, I've looked in these data sets. There's nobody in those data sets that is like me, for whatever reason. So then I don't know what optimal is for me, because I don't have a comparison group where I can say, in people like me, this is the best blood sugar, because I don't have those data. Those data don't exist. And this applies to everything. So one of the main issues with optimization is we are comparing ourselves to people who aren't like us to try and figure out what to do long term. And so if I spend all my time chasing this blood sugar level, I don't know if that's worth my time. And, people tie themselves in knots trying to figure out how to improve their blood sugar when maybe that isn't something they need to do in the first place.
Whoa. Okay, so what should they be focusing on?
What a great question. So there is another side to this where we would say that if you're you're a trainer, you're a doctor, you're working in primary care with people that look more like this average population, right? They're probably don't have the best body composition, they probably don't sleep that well, they probably have poor blood sugar, maybe they're pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. In that scenario, I can confidently say this is the range of blood sugar that you should be heading for, right? So there are in the vast majority of people, these things are useful.
Okay.
But the problem is that the optimizers are not the people where this stuff is important. So there's two different sides to this. One is, for most people, yes, I know what blood sugar level is probably going to be best for your long-term health, because you look like the average population that I generated that range in. That's great, and we know how to improve that. Physical activity, sleep, dietary improvements, lots of things we can do to improve blood sugar. We know how to do that. In the optimizer, I would probably say the opposite is going to be more beneficial, right? Because we spend so much time thinking about how do I get this best number on this tracker, or how do I, get the best possible score on this thing. For those people, I think often removing these targets is important, right? How can you get more joy out of the food that you're eating? How can you get more joy out of the sleep that you're having? How can you get more joy out of the relationships that you have? And that's something that I've seen again and again in people who work really hard to optimize, is they spend so long focusing on the numbers that they lose sight of sort of the bigger picture of, the joy and the connection in life that's possible and is out there. And that's probably really critical to their health.
I love that. And before we get to the joy and the anxiety and the stress component of this, I'd like us to just focus on the numbers on the trackers
Mm-hmm.
and the problems with that.
So there's a few potential issues, and again, like, I'm not throwing shade at any
No.
particular thing. I think the goal is admirable, right? You're trying to help people improve their behavior so that it improves their long-term health. One of the issues is associated with something called Goodhart's law, which basically says that if you have a measure, right, you're using some intermediate measure for something that matters long term, right? So I'm using my sleep tracker sleep score because I think if I improve my sleep, my health is going to improve long term, right? Or I'm going to get a decreased risk of dementia. That's the whole point of tracking your sleep, right? Because you think that it's going to improve. Hopefully, you can improve things and improve your long term health. However, what happens is that the measure becomes the goal, right? The goal is to optimize the number, right? You lose sight of why you're trying to improve that
Yeah.
number in the first place. And this is Goodhart's law, is that as soon as a measure becomes the goal, it's no longer a good measure, because we're trying to optimize the number rather than actually thinking about, well, why am I even looking at this number in the first place? So that's one thing that we have to remember. The next potential issue is that these scores are developed, but they don't really necessarily have some hard outcome, right? So on your tracker of choice, whatever it is, how is that number developed? What does it mean? Have they shown that this score is associated with actually this sleep measure robustly that's then associated with an actual improved health outcome? And in most cases, it isn't, right? It might be a reasonable approximation, but they usually haven't been tested against some sort of like hard outcome that you actually care about, right? So that's because it's just it's really hard to get that data. So that's one issue. And the final one is the quality of the data. In general, there's a lot of error
Yeah.
in these measurements, right? It's really hard to figure out what stage of sleep you're in based on something that's worn on your arm or hand, right? And that's for a number of reasons. But one being that not every part of the brain is in the same stage of sleep at the same time, right? And we don't even appreciate that kind of thing. So there's huge amounts of error in there. And then when we introduce error, we don't appreciate that when we're then looking at the number. And there have been some very nice studies that show that what we're told about our sleep affects our cognitive function, regardless of whether it's true or not. So there's a very nice study by a group at Harvard, including Ellen Langer, who's this brilliant behavioral psychologist who really likes to manipulate time, in particular people's perception of time and how that affects their health, affects their blood sugar control, all these other things. And they had people sleep for either 5 hours or 8 hours in a lab, but they manipulated the speed of the clock. So then they also thought that they'd slept either 5 or 8 hours. So some people slept 8 hours and thought they slept 8 hours, but then there were other people who slept 8 hours and were told they slept for 5 hours. What they found was that what they were told about their sleep, you slept 5 or 8 hours, was more important for cognitive function and how they felt the next day than how much time they actually slept. So if you're wearing something that's telling you about your sleep and it's wrong, but you wake up in the morning, it's like, hey, you had a bad night of sleep, like hard luck. Even if you slept great and it's just an error in the measurement, you will perform worse the next day because you think you slept poorly. So there's issues in terms of how we're using the numbers, how the numbers are developed, and error in the data. And that doesn't mean that these things shouldn't be used, right? It just means that we just have to have a lot more appreciation of potential issues in terms of how they arise. So we certainly know that tracking these things over time is probably better than a one-off, um, a one-off measure, right? That's the case for most things. And so, lots of people could do things like they don't look at their, a single night of sleep. They maybe aggregate it over time and they look at trends, right? That's probably going to be better. Or they don't look at their app right after they wake up. They maybe look at it at the end of the day, the next day, right? Because then they don't allow any issues with what came up to then affect them during the day. So there are ways around this. But we just have to be really mindful of where we are in terms of the quality of the data that we're using, and then how that affects our brains, and how what we think directly affects how we perform and our health downstream of that.
Okay, before we go to that concept of what is health and the way we think about it, do you track anything?
I track reps in the gym.
Oh, I love that. That is a noble thing to track, Tommy. That is a noble thing to track. I love it. Just I for a while I was working for a company and they gave us access to this tracking device. And one night, um, like I was wearing to track my sleep. The next morning I woke up. I didn't. Well, my dog was up the entire night. It was a disaster of a night. I never slept a wink. It was awful. The next morning, the sleep tracker told me that I had the best night of sleep I'd ever had, and that was literally the day I was like, "This is just full of nonsense. I'm throwing it away. I'm not going to stop trusting myself. Like I know when I've had a good night of sleep, and that's how I'm going to measure it from now on." Anyway, a conversation we had a little while ago, a couple of months ago, was about what is health, right? And we were talking about health being a subjective experience, and also about how the way we think about our personal health can determine the long term, like our long term health. Do you remember that? And can you expand on that?
So there's a few parts of that,
Yeah.
but I will say that I'm a big fan of the subjective, like how we subjectively feel about ourselves and our health, and then also our position in society compared to others,
I love
because
that.
that has a massive impact on our health that's been measured in multiple ways. But one of the best ways I think to track health is to ask somebody, "How healthy do you feel?" And there's actually some very nice data that says that how healthy you feel predicts mortality risk long term, right? Because part of it is, if you have some chronic conditions and you have some pain and some other things, right, you probably feel less healthy because of that, and then it's those things that are actually driving your risk long term. But equally, if we think that we are less healthy, or we are less active than we should be, or we're not doing enough, there are lots of studies that show that even if you adjust for everything, right, so people who have the same health conditions, the same blood tests, they sleep the same, they have the same level of physical activity, right, they're the same level of education, socioeconomic status, and you have two people, everything else is the same, but one person thinks they're less healthy than they could be, and the other person's like, "I'm great," right? That second person will live longer. And so part of it is, right, this is where you can't do randomized controlled trials. So I can't
No.
say this is perfectly causal, right? But from the data, and then there are other studies that look at how we think and how it affects our physiology. If you are constantly demoting yourself, both within yourself and compared to others, it negatively affects stress hormone levels, inflammation, the autonomic nervous system. It's this stressor that we create within ourselves that lowers our status. And by doing that, our subjective status, and by doing that, you're affecting all these physiological pathways that then increases your risk of disease or death long term. So this is why I'm a big fan of the subjective, because how you think about yourself, both within yourself and compared to others, that directly affects your physiology and your health. And I was actually, I didn't sleep that well last night because I woke up at 5 a.m. or something, and I was
Uh-huh.
thinking about that we're going to have
Yeah.
this conversation today, and I had this sudden thought,
Uh-huh.
which was related to a talk that I saw at a conference I went to last week. The talk is by a guy called Javino McLean, who you should follow on Instagram because he is one of the most amazing people in the entire world.
I'm
He
gonna
runs a gym a free gym for people from disadvantaged communities and the disabled. Um, and he's just this amazing human in
And that's
terms of
exactly who you're talking
positivity
about.
and all this.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it was amazing listening to him speak. And one thing that he said was that the people who are the most um, miserable to train, I'll use the words that he used, was rich people. Um, and
Yeah.
but the reason for it, I think,
Uh-huh.
is more meaningful. The reason
Totally.
is that in our modern society, people like you and me, we get attention when we achieve some task and we do it well, right? So, and we do this we post it on social media or in our jobs, right? You get a pat on the back every time you did a bit of work, and somebody can say like, "Attaboy, have a gold star," and then the attention disappears until you do it again, right? And that's the kind of, you know, those kind of individuals who are used to that kind of attention, they just have to keep doing that so they can actually get some feedback, some interaction with somebody else, some love from somebody else, some attention, because hey, I did the thing that you wanted me to do. Here, now praise me. Whereas what we actually want is this continued unconditional love and attention, right? It shouldn't matter if you do those things or not. You should get love from yourself and from others because of who you are. And this made me think about trackers because we use them to give ourselves pats on the back, right? So we can kind of say, hey, aren't I good? I got this sleep score on this thing, right? So we're doing the same thing to ourselves that society has kind of driven us into, which is another, and sort of like this links back into this idea then that um, we're losing, you know, as we objectify these things, and by objectify I mean add numbers to them. We lose these things that should be inherently joyful. I think food and sleep are probably the most obvious ones. And there are data to suggest that as soon as you objectify something, it becomes less pleasurable, right? And food should be part of right. It should be nourishing. It should be part of the way that we connect to others, the way that we connect to ourselves. And when we objectify it with continuous glucose monitors and counting macros, we will inherently lose some of the pleasure in it that should be there. So this was that was kind of like a lot. This is what I was thinking about at 5 o'clock this morning when I couldn't sleep.
I
Was how
love
we're kind
that.
of using these trackers to kind of give ourselves a little pat on the back, because that's the only way that we know that we can receive um, joy and attention, apparently even from ourselves.
I mean, it's sad, Tommy. Like when you started talking about that, it's a very sad state of affairs that we find ourselves in, right? Like we are stuck in this vicious cycle of wanting to achieve these optimal numbers on trackers from trackers that have no real they're not human, you know what I mean? Like we're losing this like community and connection that you talk about. We're robbing ourselves of this real joy of achieving things where we self-motivate ourselves in this effort to optimize a life that actually is going to be negatively affected because we are so stressed and anxious about it.
Yeah, and that's the other side of one of those things that I mentioned about how we place ourselves, or you know, how we think about ourselves both internally but then compared to others. Right, the process of optimization requires you, almost inherently requires you to say, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing well enough,
Yeah.
I need to improve, right? So you're in order to optimize, you almost have to tell yourself that you're not good enough in order
Totally.
to strive to do it, right? And that internal monologue, again, large bodies of data showing that directly affects directly affects our physiology, which is another reason why I think that this strive for optimal, right? Strive for improvement, absolutely. I think everybody can do that in a variety of aspects of their lives. But this strive for optimal, that there's this some mythical goal that you'll never actually be able to achieve. Like that's, I think, is damaging to ourselves.
So to me, it sounds like you're talking about mindset or what a lot of people refer to as mindset. Do you have an aversion to the term mindset, or is this what you're talking about?
No, I don't have any aversion
Okay.
to the idea of mindset. And there's two mindsets that I try and ascribe to. One is the growth mindset, and the
Okay.
other is the abundance mindset. Um, and you know how you then frame that, and um, how it sort of plays out. It's different from person to person. But no, I think the idea of mindset is can be really really important and powerful.
Would you mind going into the growth and the abundance mindset and what that means to you?
Yeah. So the growth mindset is a, a book written by Dweck. Lots of people should, everybody should read,
Yep.
um, which basically just says that, or you're continuously capable of getting better and learning and improving, rather than the fixed mindset that says I can't do this, I'm not somebody who's good at this, right? Just essentially entering into any scenario with the idea that you are capable of learning and growth and improvement. Um, and then the abundance mindset, the the main way that I think about it is Jenny Wright. I'm an academic, um, and trained in medicine, and in those worlds, often people come at it with a scarcity mindset, which basically says that in order for me to do well, somebody else has to do poorly, right?
Yeah.
So I will do whatever it takes to further myself, and often that requires decreasing what other people are capable of or can achieve. Whereas an abundance mindset, do you know what says? There's enough for everybody.
Absolutely.
There's enough academic accolade. There's enough funding. There's enough papers. There's enough patience, right? There's enough people to listen to your podcasts that you don't have to put somebody else down in order to achieve yourself. And actually, um, and what probably happens is that if I achieve more and we do it together, then we both achieve more, right? You end up multiplying things. So that's how I apply that in my career. Like I remember one time in medical school when there was some new exam that they were going to give us, and the way I always thought about medical school was it was not me against my colleagues. It was like all of us against the system, just trying to become the best doctors that we could be. So I basically wrote all the notes that would be needed in order to do as well in this exam as possible. And because it was brand new, I knew most of my other colleagues hadn't done it yet. So I just sent them all my notes. I was like, just because I do well doesn't mean, right, if you do well, it doesn't stop me doing well.
Exactly.
And then we do better together. So that's how I approach that kind of thing.
I love that. And I have to tell you that I see that in the way that you share my posts on social media. And you know what I mean? Like, just like a lot of people are not willing to do that and not willing to support other people, especially not people who are less than them, right? Or who you may feel that there's no benefit from helping. And so you definitely walk that talk from what I have experienced by knowing you and by, seeing how you behave on social media. Not that you needed any feedback from me, but I thought you don't use a tracker, so I may as well give you some positive feedback right now.
There's this famous quote. I can't remember who it's by, but it basically says that you can tell a lot about somebody by how they treat somebody who can't offer them anything, right? And I think that that's something that I can't always say that I've lived by that, but that's an important. I certainly try to.
Absolutely, to the best of your ability in that moment, for sure. I believe that. Um, I have one more question. And this is one of these things that really irks me. And you don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
Okay.
It's this constant optimization and trying to trick our bodies into being better by doing things like genomic testing and trying to
Hmm.
prevent things that may possibly go wrong in the future that possibly may not either. How do you feel about answering this? Genomics.
Wait, was that a question?
Yeah, genomics. How do you feel about genomic testing and this like trying to to trick our
um,
genes?
yeah, it's there's multiple parts to this.
Okay.
One, of course, our health output, be that the diseases that we are afflicted by, you know, the time that we die, is an interaction between our lifestyle, environment, exposures, and our genetics, right? Of course. So for a given exposure, your genes will affect how that exposure affects your health. And we know that's true. Whether we can actually usefully implement that information currently, I would argue that in most cases we can't. And the reason for that is that we don't know enough about the system, about how all those things interact, to make useful decisions that are evidence-based. So say you have some genes that predispose you to prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, right? Some people would say, well, then you have to do all these things proactively to decrease your risk of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. I would argue that you should just measure your blood sugar, and that should be the thing that you go based off of, because adding the genes in doesn't actually change what you would do, right? The same things still matter. And in some people, even if they have a genetic risk of prediabetes or diabetes, they never get it, right?
Yeah.
So knowing that genetic predisposition doesn't help them at all. And a good example of this is there are lots of studies in hunter-gatherer groups like the Bolivian Chimene, who have several, in a population, have several genes that are common, or polymorphisms that are common, that would increase their risk of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. But they have a 0% prevalence of type 2 diabetes. None of them get it, right? Because it's all environment, right? It's all environmentally driven. So the thing is that the answer, the intervention, is always the same, regardless of your genetics, until we get to a point where you say, because of this exact, in this scenario, with these polymorphisms, this is the intervention, and it's only the intervention because we know of your genes, right? Then it becomes important. And there's almost no scenario where that's the case currently. In the meantime, what we do is we dramatically increase our stress related to our predisposition. And right, some people, and it's the same with trackers. There is a minority of, it's a non-zero number, but there is a minority of people who can very dispassionately separate out these pieces of information. Their tracker data, right? Their tracker will tell them that they slept poorly, and they don't internalize that at all. It doesn't affect them, right? Or they can look at their genetic risk and it doesn't affect their stress levels. Great, right? If you know that about yourself and you can do that, nothing should stop you. But so an example is the ApoE genotype and Alzheimer's disease. So there are 3 types. ApoE4, if you have 1 or 2 copies, you have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Some people will say that everybody should get this tested because we know it's a risk factor. It's a risk factor. It interacts with our environment. We know that. And then if you know you're at high risk, maybe that's going to drive you to make more changes related to your lifestyle that can decrease your risk of dementia. In some proportion of people, that could absolutely be the case. But there are studies where they provided people with their genetic risk, and they said, I wish I'd never known, because all it's done is made me stressed. And that stress is going to increase your risk of dementia, regardless of your genotype. So it's not that these things aren't useful. It's just that we have to be really mindful of the kind of people we are and how we use this information and how it affects us. And when it comes to genetics, in most cases, in most polymorphisms, there's no data that says adding in the genetic data changes what you'll do, right? If you're trying to improve your blood sugar, all the things are this, right? In terms of dietary modifications we can make, you're going to have lots of people talk about that. In terms of physical activity, in terms of sleep, right? There's nothing that I would do differently to decrease my risk of type 2 diabetes based on genetics yet. That may well change, but for most things, I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, great. Okay, last question, I promise, because this was supposed to be 20 minutes, but I have loved talking to you so much. So very practically speaking, how do we draw this, how do we find this balance with wanting to achieve goals and wanting to understand what to track and what not to track, and being the best versions of ourselves, or however you want to put it?
The main thing is just being mindful of what it is that we're trying to achieve, right? Keep the goal the goal. So
Yeah.
don't make these intermediate things the goal. And we've talked about why that's problematic. So in general, if you're collecting data, you probably only need to do it for a short period of time. Some period of time tracking your sleep. And again, if you look at trends over time, and you maybe record some subjective stuff, you can probably figure out the things that are going to negatively affect your sleep. And it's going to be something around noise, temperature, when you eat relative to your bedtime, like what you other things you expose yourself relative to your bedtime, right? In the vast majority of cases. And then if that's not the case, then maybe you need to see an insomnia expert. CBT for insomnia is really good, right? There are other things you can
Yeah.
do. But some short period of concerted data collection is great, but that doesn't mean that you need to wear your sleep tracker for the rest of your life. And I would advocate for the same thing for, say, continuous glucose monitors. There is more error in continuous glucose monitors than I actually thought previously. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about another study. I know this is a
Yeah.
short final
No,
question,
do it.
but
No, I'm
I,
happy.
so there's a study. It came out as a preprint, so it's not fully published yet, but it was by Kevin Hall, who does all these
Yeah.
really big, in-depth metabolic ward studies. And they took data from some of these metabolic ward studies where they had individuals on diets that rotated. So they were like they're in a room, they're fed exactly the same thing every day, everything is tracked. And they had meals on a rotation. So for each participant, they have at least two incidences where they ate exactly the same meal and then they looked at the continuous glucose responses. And in the same person eating the same meal, like a week apart or 2 weeks apart, the CGM response was as if they were eating two completely different meals.
What?
Doesn't that completely blow your mind?
It completely blows my mind.
So, and we have lots of other data that says, there are so many things that affect your glucose response, when it is during the day, whether and when you exercised, what you ate before, how you slept, all this stuff. So I used to say, well, we eat the same. We're creatures of habit. We eat the same things again and again and again. So you probably only need
Yeah.
2 or 4 weeks of CGM data because you're going to see the same response to the same meal several times. Based on this study, I can't confidently say that anymore, right? Because eating exactly the same meal in the same person a week apart, they see completely different blood sugar responses. So that doesn't mean that it's not useful, but I think just tracking responses to things you very frequently eat, and then you see, well, do you know what, this causes this massive spike in my blood sugar, maybe that's something I should eat less of. That can still be helpful, but that doesn't mean you need to wear a CGM every day for the rest of your life, which some people do. So to get back to your question, just be mindful of, like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you tracking these things? What is it that you're going to try and improve? Like, what's your long-term goal? And make the goal, and make sure that anything that you're doing in the intermediate period is serving that long-term goal. And it could be getting to 80 years old and still being able to play with your grandkids, right? That's a very common long-term goal. So then just think about, how much does obsessing over my sleep right now contribute to that goal? Because what you really want to do is you want to create sleep habits that will provide you good quality sleep for the next 50 years, right? That's what you're trying to do. So just like bear that in mind. And then remember that the data that you're comparing to may not be from people like you, so may not be relevant. There's going to be error in there. So like, don't make this right. Just remember that whatever you're told the next morning in your app may be completely wrong, and just bear that in mind. And then, just remember that a lot of these things that you're trying to optimize are things that, maybe should have more joy and less objectivity, or at least occasionally. That's kind of part of the point. So like, those are the ways that I approach it. So these things can be useful, but just remember what the long-term goal is.
Tommy, this is an absolutely perfect way to end. This is by far my favorite conversation that I've had. And I can't thank you
Thanks.
enough for just always being so willing to do these interviews with me and speak at these events. I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. This was great as ever. Fantastic questions. Really enjoy plumbing the depths of the weird and wonderful world of health with you. Always appreciate that.
Perfect. And here's to an unoptimized life.
Yes. Cheers.